Tale of Terror on Halloween, written by Kelly Maida and narrated by Kelly Maida. Every channel on the television had the same news about the Halloween killer. I could not run from it, so I decided to leave the TV on. The news reporter said, "This just in, the Halloween killer has just been arrested. He has been identified as Fred Riley." They titled the name of the show that night, "A Look into the Eyes of a Madman." The Halloween killer was very seductive and alluring, but he had a morbid curiosity with death. They interviewed several witnesses who said he watched horror movies day and night, and his house was all filled with Halloween decorations. He enjoyed watching horror movies because he loved the idea of killing someone. It was just an idea at first, but the more he watched horror movies, the more he wanted to kill. He had a rage brewing inside him and a dark secret that eventually drove him to madness and on a killing spree. I sat in amazement while seeing my man portrayed as this monster. His mother was the deep, dark secret. She did unspeakable things to him as a child. In fact, when he went on the murdering spree, his mother was on the top of his list. A witness that they interviewed was a close friend of his, said he has been watching horror movies since he was 7 years old and he had a bad temper. Fred would find out your fears or dislikes and torture you with it. Sometimes he would get violent when he was drunk and punch holes in walls and break his doors and cabinets. Then another woman was interviewed that knew him from school and said how sweet and kind he was. The most interesting interview was a man that would not show his identity. He said that he used to be friends with Fred, but they stopped talking because of Fred's alcohol problem. Fred always felt cheated and wronged by society as well as in general. He never really made any sense. All of a sudden, there was a loud noise outside my house. It was the cops and an investigator along with 3 policemen. They knocked at my door. My heart started to race. I feared what I was about to face. What did they know? I opened the door, wearing my Sunday's best yellow and white polka dotted dress. The investigator said, "Are you Lee Morrow?" I replied, "Yes, I am. How may I help you?" He said, "I am Detective Diggs, and I am here to ask you some questions." I graciously let Detective Diggs inside, and the cop stayed outside. He first asked how I knew the Halloween killer, a.k.a. Fred Riley. I smiled and said, "We met in an odd way. It was in a cemetery. It was a foggy day, and as it started to lift, I saw a man walking towards me. It will be 2 years ago next month. I was just visiting a friend that passed away. A raven sat on top of a tombstone near me. I should have taken it as a warning. I still remember that day. The moon was full and it looked orange that night. He was tall, about 6 feet, and he had dark brown hair with waves in it. His hair was always in his eyes, and he would constantly keep moving it out of his face. His eyes were dark brown, so dark they were as dark as the dead of night. His eyes had a sweetness and confusion in them. He introduced himself, and he made a joke at the cemetery. He said he always visits his victims, and he laughed. He said he was just kidding, that he was visiting his dad who passed away a few years ago. We started talking, and he was so interesting. Fred and I had so much in common. He seemed so knowledgeable about movies and television shows. He said that he owned his own business, that it was a pet shelter, and he took care of animals. When I first met him, he kept touching his eyes and hair nervously. Every time he tried to pick up his phone or soda, he would drop it. He said he is really not much of a people person. He's more of a homebody, and he never goes out. He was nervous in a sweet way, and he was romantic. As time went on, we started spending almost every day together. He would bring me to the ocean, and we would take walks on the beach. We would also go out to eat and go grocery shopping together. One day, he was late showing up to my house, and his mother texted me, and she said, "I hope it's okay that I'm reaching out to you. I took your number out of Fred's phone, and she asked me if he made it to my house yet." I said, "Not yet. Why?" She said, "I just wanted to make sure he was okay." When Fred showed up, I told him his mother called. He smiled and instantly froze. He started to yell and say, "Oh my God, I can't get away from that crazy old woman." I said, "What is wrong?" He said, "You have not even met her yet, and she is stalking you," he said. She does this to every woman that I meet and tries to poison people against me. I said, she seems so sweet. He said, yes, that is what she wants you and everyone else to believe. She is obsessed with me and is driving me mad. He said, I am 37 years old. I'm a grown man. He then asked me what she said to me, and I told him she just asked if he made it there okay. He excused himself, and he walked out of my house. He then called his mother and started screaming and threatening her. I found this quite amusing. His mother seemed very crazy. He then came back inside and asked if I believed her or him. I said, I believe you. He then mentioned how his mother keeps tabs on him and for some reason did not like him getting close to a woman, that she would make up stories about him. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. At this point, Fred and I were pretty serious. We saw each other almost every day. Then a few days later, I went to his house for the first time, and his mother was there. She stops by his house daily to help him clean and to bring him food, and they play card games together and watch horror movies. I felt like I was in the Twilight Zone episode. She spoke to him in a baby's voice, as if he was an infant, and when she laughed, she had this cackle like a witch. He acted like this was amusing to him, and he would talk back to her like that. They would also pat each other on the head and laugh like two maniacs in a psych ward. Fred looked at his mom and said, Mom, I will talk to you later. I have plans with Lee. She then went over to him and kissed him on the lips. I did not think much of it until later that night. Fred started to drink too much and said his mother was ruining his life and how obsessed she was with him. I asked him what he meant. I said, what are you talking about? But he would never answer me, and instead he kept going on to the next subject. He then looked at me and held me tight and said that I saved him. I said, how did I do that? He said that he's always been so fascinated by serial killers and the idea of killing people, but I lightened up the dark part of his heart. He said true love saves people and that I saved him. He said if it was not for me, he would be a monster. I kept asking him what that meant, and he fell asleep in my arms. I felt so awful for Fred. When he fell asleep, I quietly tiptoed out of the house. His house was beautifully arranged. Every corner of his house had Halloween decorations. His house looked like an old abandoned insane asylum. He had skulls and skeletons and bat lights on the walls. He also had clowns and horror movies laying around everywhere, not to mention Ouija boards and Halloween dolls. At this point, I was starting to get disturbed by his anger that he had for his mom and his obsession with horror movies and death. Everything seemed to be getting a little bit better, though, as the weeks went by. But then on Halloween night, we watched several horror movies, and we passed out candy to kids at Fred's house. The detective interrupted me and he informed me the rest of the events. The detective said, it is odd from the evidence that was found. He said there had to be a second person and there was another set of footprints that had not been identified. The detective looked at me and said there was a witness that Fred confessed the murders to. Somehow the witness just vanished. We do know that Fred went to his mother's house first. The door was kicked in. It looked like a struggle. Since his mother is dead, we do not know what happened. I interrupted and said, this does not sound like my sugar cookie. I don't believe it. The detective gave me a dirty look and proceeded with the story. He then proceeded to his next victim, Maureen. She was someone he just met at a coffee shop. Not much else is known about her. The detective looked at me, and he said, including his mother and Maureen, he killed 10 people. All the victims died in a gruesome manner. The most disturbing part is how he left his victims. He put Halloween masks on their head and put strings of Halloween lights around them and plugged them in so the lights were all lit. The bodies were mutilated and cut up from head to toe. The detective proceeded to take out pictures of Fred's victims. But I could not bear to look at the pictures. The detective looked at me and said, there's not enough information to hold Fred. The only witness we had disappeared. Then the detective looked at me upset and said, is there anything else that you know? Before you answer, just remember your place is being watched and so are you. Even if Fred gets released, I will still keep an eye on the two of you. I looked at him and said, look, I told you everything that I know. Then I said, Detective, I think it is time you left unless you have a warrant. The detective looked at me and said, no, I don't. I will leave you now, but I am sure I will see you again soon. I looked at him and smiled and said, my mama always said, don't count all your chickens till they hatch. Then the detective turned his back on me and walked out. Then my doorbell rang. I opened my door and started complaining and said, what do you want now, detective? And in my surprise, it was Fred. He gave me a huge hug and kiss and said, get in my car, Angel. Fred looked up at me and said, I love you to the moon and back, my little soul flame of fire. I smiled at Fred and said, we have a quick stop to make, love bug. I laughed and said, now do I have a surprise for you? You know that little snitch eyewitness that tried to tell on you? I have her tied up in the basement of your place. Fred looked at me and said, now this is one of the many reasons that I love you. Fred then said he remembers how innocent I was until the day he met me at the cemetery, and he taught me how to stick up for myself ever since. Once we got to Fred's house, I quickly ran down the stairs to find the witness tied up. I looked at Fred and said, so who is going to do the honors of carving her? Maybe we can start with her eyes because she is an eyewitness. We both then laughed hysterically. He looked at me and said, God, it's good to be back with you. I closed the book and looked around to see my friends' faces. And they were hiding under the blanket by the campfire. My friend Julie looked up from the blankets and said, Gwen, is this a true story? I looked at her and said, no, it's just a story, Julie. Well, what if Fred and Lee are out there somewhere? I looked at her and said, no, it's just a story. Now let's go inside. I'm tired. As we got up to open the sliding glass doors, we noticed the lights were off. As I opened the door, the lights in the kitchen turned on, and Julie and I both screamed at the same time. It was just my mom. She was checking on us to make sure we were okay. The end.